In this video, we're going to look at two examples of factoring quadratics by grouping. The first example we have is 2x squared plus 3x minus 2. Now, just starting off, I'm not even sure that this quadratic can be factored, so I'm first just going to check that it can be factored. I made a separate video showing how you can tell whether or not a quadratic can be factored, and I'll also link that in this video so you can go check that out if you want to see it. But what I'm going to do to figure out whether or not this quadratic can be factored is I'm going to calculate b squared minus 4ac. Off to the side here, I'll just make a quick note that a is 2. B is 3, and C is negative 2. So B squared minus 4AC is 3 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 2, which is equal to 9 plus 16, which is 25. And 25 is a positive perfect square. And so because that is a positive perfect square, I know that this quadratic can be factored. Now, I intentionally chose this example because it is not always super easy to factor a quadratic when a, the number in front of x squared, is not equal to 1. So we're going to factor this by grouping. And to factor this by grouping, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a and I'm going to take c and I'm going to multiply them to give me negative 4. So what I'm looking for is I need two numbers that will multiply to negative 4, but will add to 3. And two numbers that do that are a positive 4 and a negative 1. Positive 4 and negative 1 will multiply to negative 4 and they'll add up to positive 3. So I'm going to use those two numbers to rewrite this 3x term. So I'm going to keep the 2x squared term in the front the same, and I'm going to keep the negative 2 term at the end the same, but then in the middle, I'm going to replace that plus 3x with a positive 4x and a negative 1x, because this is the exact same thing as the 3x that we had to start with. So now I've rewritten the quadratic with 4 terms instead of just 3, and now I'm ready to start grouping. I'm going to group my first two terms together, and I'm going to group my second two terms together. So looking inside the first group, what's underlined in green, I'm looking for what those terms have in common that we can factor out. So between 2x squared and 4x, they have a 2x in common that we can pull out. And pulling a 2x out will leave us with an x plus 2. Now looking at the two terms in red, the negative 1x and the negative 2, they have a negative 1 in common that we can factor out. That leaves us with an x plus 2. Now both of these terms in green and red both have this x plus 2. So I'm going to factor that x plus 2 out. The green term left us with a 2x right there. And the red term left us with a negative 1. And so now we have factored this quadratic by grouping. The next example that we're going to look at, 5x squared plus 14x minus 3. So we're going to get started the same way by multiplying our leading coefficient of 5 and our constant term of negative 3 to give us a negative 15. And now I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 15, but add up to a positive 14. And the two numbers that do that are a positive 15 and a negative 1. So I'm going to use a positive 15 and a negative 1 to rewrite this positive 14x term that we have in the middle. So I'm going to keep the 5x squared term the same, and I'm also going to keep the negative 3 at the end the same, but I'm going to replace the plus 14x with the plus 15x minus 1x. And now I'm ready to create my two groups. My first group comes from the first two terms, and my second group comes from the second two terms. Looking at my first two terms, what they have in common that I can factor out is a positive 5x, which is going to leave us with an x plus 3, And then looking at the second two terms, what they have in common is a -1, which is going to leave us with an x plus 3. And when you're factoring by grouping, what you want is you want this same common factor to show up in both of those terms, just like it showed up over here, so that you can factor that out. Then what we're left with in red was the 5x, and what we're left with in green was the -1. So now we have factored this quadratic.